All right, let's take a trip way, way back in time. Thousands of years, actually, to the ancient Near East. Now, this was a world of absolutely epic, sprawling empires, powerful gods, and really complex societies. But beyond all the epic battles and grand monuments, how did these civilizations actually work? We're going to dig into how they waged war, how they struck these high stakes deals, and what life was really like for the folks on the ground. So that's the big question, right? What was it truly like to live back then? We always hear about the kings and the massive conquests, but what about the laws that govern people's lives, the tricky diplomacy, the day-to-day grind? We're going to peel back all those layers, starting with the grand scale of empires and zooming all the way down to the personal level. So let's kick things off with the biggest players on the map. You just can't talk about empires in this part of the world without starting with the Neo-Assyrians. I mean, for centuries, these guys were the absolute definition of a military superpower. They were a relentless, terrifying war machine that really came to define what imperial ambition and total control looked like. Now, the Assyrians didn't just pop up out of nowhere, but their rise to the top was incredibly fast. Kicking off around 900 BCE, they just started this steady march of conquest. By 727 BCE, they were the undisputed champs of the region. Their absolute peak, that came in 671 BCE when they conquered Egypt, which was a huge, huge deal. But here's the crazy part. Their time at the top was super short-lived. By the end of that very same century, poof, they were gone, overthrown by up-and-coming powers like Babylonia. It's just a wild reminder of how fast the tables could turn in the ancient world. And just to put their power into perspective, one source describes it like this. They had a degree of territorial control far surpassing that of any earlier empire of the region. So think about that. They weren't just another kingdom on the block. They were a true superstate on a scale nobody had ever seen before, stretching all the way from modern-day Iran clear over to Egypt. So how in the world did they manage such a massive territory? Well, one of their key tools was the vassal state. A vassal king was, technically still the boss in his own kingdom. But when the Assyrian emperor called, he had to answer. He had to send troops, he had to send goods, and he had to follow their political lead, no questions asked. I mean, just imagine being Babylonia, this once great, proud kingdom, now basically a subordinate, forced to bow to the Assyrian machine. But here's the thing, even for the Assyrians, constant war was expensive, it was risky. So, what happened when empires needed to talk instead of fight? Well, that gets us into the much more subtle and often way more dangerous game of ancient diplomacy. An ambassador's mission, it was like this carefully choreographed performance. It all started with a king sending out his representative, and not just with a message, but with a seriously valuable gift. Now, this ambassador expected to be treated with respect. Think of it like diplomatic immunity. But the real moment of truth, the climax of the whole thing, was the exchange. The king on the other end was expected, by honor, to give back a gift of equal, or even better, greater value. The entire relationship between two whole kingdoms could hang on this single moment. And the outcome of this gift exchange? It meant everything. Literally everything. If a valuable gift came back, it was a sign of respect, of goodwill. The alliance was strong. But if that ambassador came back empty-handed, whoa, that was a massive insult. It pretty much meant that diplomatic ties were cut, and it was very often the first step towards getting the armies ready for war. Of course, gift-giving wasn't the only move in the diplomatic playbook. Another huge one was strategic marriages. Kings would send their own kids off to foreign courts to create literal family ties. You also had smaller kingdoms teaming up, forming alliances to protect themselves from giants like the Assyrians. And sometimes, the simplest solution was just to pay tribute, basically protection money, to keep a stronger neighbor from invading. Okay, so we've seen the big picture world of empires and kings, but let's zoom all the way in. What was life like for regular people? And for that, there is no better place to look than Old Babylon and one of the most famous legal documents in all of history, the Code of Hammurabi. So Hammurabi's code shows us a society that was neatly divided into three main social classes. You had the Awelum, who were the nobles, the elite. Then you had the Mushkinim, the commoners, and at the bottom were the Wardum, the enslaved people. Now, these weren't totally rigid castes you were stuck in forever, but under the law, your class decided everything, your rights, your value, and even how you were punished. You know that famous principle, an eye for an eye? This is a perfect example of how it really worked. It wasn't about universal justice for all. It was all about your social rank. If a commoner hurt a noble, the punishment was literal, an eye for an eye. But if a noble did the exact same thing to a commoner, well, they could often just get away with paying a fine. Justice in Hammurabi's Babylon was not blind, not even close. It was looking very carefully at your social status. And this class division was literally built into the city's streets. The rich folks, they lived in these big, multi-room houses built around courtyards, sometimes with fancy stuff like bathrooms. Commoners, on the other hand, lived in simple, windowless, mud brick houses where the flat roofs basically became extra living space for chores. The very walls around you were a constant, daily reminder of your place in the world. So, was the Babylonian way the only model out there? Not at all. To get a fuller picture, let's bring in another major power from the time, the Hittites, and their world was just fundamentally different. It really shows you how diverse life could be across the ancient Near East. Yeah, the contrast here is pretty stark. Babylon was all about big cities defined by strict laws and social classes. The Hittite world? It was mostly rural, organized around small villages where land was often farmed by everyone together. And this difference went all the way to the top. In Babylon, the king was seen as a servant of the gods. But for the Hittites, the king was the high priest. He was the direct connection between humanity and the divine. Hittite religion itself was this really cool mix of cultures. They actually borrowed rituals from Mesopotamia, like studying animal organs to try and predict the future. But they also had their own superstar gods, like the powerful sun goddess and the weather god. And tying it all together was the king. He wasn't just a political leader, he was the head religious figure, the high priest during all the big festivals, which made him the center of both the state and their faith. And all of this brings us to one last thought. We've seen empires use war and vassal states to project their power. We've seen how diplomacy could hinge on these high-stakes gift exchanges just to keep the peace. And we've seen how law could be used to lock in a social hierarchy. So when you look at our world today, at international relations, at our own social structures, you really have to ask yourself, have the fundamental rules of power, law, and diplomacy really changed all that much?